Okay, this is going to be quite a strange recording because I can only sort of call this wild political speculation, and in some sense, this is meant to be a kind of imaginative exploration and to explore the various possible paths forward, what ways the current situation in South Africa could transpire and what they might precipitate into. And so I have a thought experiment at the start, which I know is something that is not going to happen, but just exploring why it doesn't work in reality, and also show how some synthesis of it might happen after a national election that radically changes things, or if the ANC falls under a majority, how it might in some form come into play. So, um, the current turmoil in South Africa, I think, can generally be conceived of as a civil war within the ANC. And in some sense, what this might also do is it might, hopefully, I hope that it will shed some light on the kind of toxic kleptoparasitism that is the ideology of blaming a scapegoat and using a kind of narrative and a moral relativism that facilitates corruption. And in some sense, the two factions in the ANC that are at war with one another are fighting over the ideological implements of the continuing grift. And so they both rely on a kind of low information democratic deficit, in the voters, and them being pandered to and indulged with a kind of racialist politics. So you have a kind of fight over which version of that kind of ideology. Obviously, the RET faction is much more radical and much more overt in its looting. It wants a kind of a more obviously failed state and a dictatorial style and a more simple extraction from the scapegoat. A more simple, well, we'll take your land, and it's so fine if we can take your land, so as long as you're white. Whereas Cyril Ramaphosa, in some sense, still is part of a government that is facilitating the same kind of parasitism, the same kind of extraction and blaming of the same kind of racialist narrative and toxic racial nationalism, but much more cryptically disguised, much more sophisticated in legalizing it, in sort of wrapping it in a constitutional amendment in some sense, and trying to facilitate it in some kind of systematized and sort of regulated manner so that it can kind of go undetected for what it really is, which is the same grift, just with slightly better window dressing, more sophisticated window dressing. Which is, in some sense, is scapegoating the more vulgar and crude version of the same grift. So it's throwing the RET faction under the bus in order to help renew its image as a credible political party that is serious about clamping down on corruption, even though essentially black economic empowerment as it stands in the law is fundamentally corruption. It is the it is the it is corruption in the law itself. And I would say that the law has even institutionally corrupted itself in order to rationalize and to sustain it. They've invented this crazy jurisprudence that the government has a governmental prerogative when it comes to affirmative action, and therefore you cannot look at the efficacy of black economic empowerment legislation. You cannot actually measure it as if it's worth a cost or what the effect of this policy is on the ground. They've said, we're not going to use the limitations clause. We're not going to test this policy against the limitations clause to see if it's worth it, because there's a governmental prerogative, so we're not even going to do our job. Even though it says in the Constitution that the only way to limit the right of an individual is through the limitations clause, and they say, well, it's they kind of they latch onto some semantic excuse that they say, well, in a democratic society the government has a prerogative, and therefore because of the governmental prerogative we don't have to continue using the limitations clause. So they have overtly betrayed the Constitution in order to endorse this kind of racial narrative, sort of construction. They are part of this institutionalized corruption. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I do think that we need a proper constitutional court that is actually willing to defend the Constitution and defend the rights of people against this egregious assault on social justice, which has never been about group versus group. It's been about the individual versus the collective action of the state. That is how it was also, I would say, framed by Orwell, who invented the phrase social justice. It's quite ironic that it has been part of this double speak and part of this egregious racial, national, sort of fascistic cultural movement that now, is fighting over the implements of this kleptoparasitism. Anyway, this is much the same as what I was saying in the other recording, talking about, sort of the moral kleptoparasitism, which is how this thing insulates itself and makes its moral relativism invulnerable to basic facts and common standards and proper invigilation and proper political debate. All goes off the table because you're just blaming the scapegoat for everything, and there's no political accountability. There's no responsible leadership ever, and they can always just keep on pushing the same solution that is causing the problem, but they never take ownership of that because they can just divert it onto the scapegoat. So it's a never-ending grift. Anyway, okay, so we've got the civil war within the ANC. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa, if he actually cared about the country, perhaps could use this crisis as an opportunity. And I know that he won't do this, but essentially this is what he could do. He could say the state does not have the capacity to provide for its population. The charade of state-led or state-driven development is now has to be laid down and abandoned. If we have to value the private sector, and we have to try something different. Instead of actually doing this in a state-led way, we have to switch tacks, especially in this crisis, because otherwise capacity, the state never even had the capacity, but the capacity that the state wielded was often retrograde. It diminished the capacity for growth. It diminished development, and it also created a lot of artificial and unsustainable development. So what Cyril Ramaphosa could do is he could essentially suspend or seek to remove all the racialist legislation, all the black economic empowerment stuff. He could remove a lot of red tape over economic things. He could lower the tax rate to spur entrepreneurship and development. He could say that the state needs to get out of the way of the private sector, so we can actually try to develop out of this. And at the same time, he would have to scrap EWC and the NHI as just sort of just completely lunatic wishful thinking as part of this grift, to and which were just excuses for the state to get its hands on more resources that it could corruptly divert into its patronage networks and such. And obviously he wouldn't be able to do this because the ANC itself is fundamentally premised in state looting and premised in state patronage. So obviously he wouldn't have the political legs on which to stand on in order to try to push this through. And even if he did, there would be a credibility problem, because if he tried to get out of the way of the private sector to actually have an organic growth and development, and the state could actually just focus on what it should do, which is to try to promote the conditions of security and safety and support the private sector by focusing on education, by focusing on policing and security, instead of and actually focus on that instead of focusing on the corruption grift, focusing on the black economic empowerment, which allows them to funnel money into state patronage. The politicians could actually do their job. So could do their proper job rather than doing their grifting job and their kleptoparasitism. which is disguised by this, this moral scapegoating and this moral relativism and the racial black consciousness and other fascistic forms of corruption of the law, etc., etc. So, um, yeah, so the problem would be is even if they did try to get out of the way of the of the private sector, people would imagine that this is perhaps not sustainable or something like this, or this, even if Cyril Ramaphosa did this, it would fall into the hands of the people who are conducting the civil war against him, um, who are basically saying you are an agent of white monopoly capital and we are the true uh, we hold the interests of the black identity paramount, and we are the true representatives. We are the true vanguard of the black identity. You're not the vanguard of the black identity, and you are captured by white monopoly capital. And Cyril Ramaphosa can't even make condemnation against the rhetoric that is fueling the political component of this civil war within the ANC against him, or from the RET faction against him. Because if he said, I'm not an agent of white monopoly capital is a paranoid conspiracy theory used by corrupt politicians to continue their grift, he can't say that. He can't debunk the accusation of white monopoly capital because that is the glue that holds the ANC together. That is fundamental. He has just got a more sophisticated version of the same grift. So this is fundamentally problematic, is that whenever he condemns the looting, he has to do so in the most tepid, in the most mild, in the most, just calling it criminality, instead of actually citing the political component of it and the political, the orchestrated component of it. Like, yes, there are a lot of people that are looting because they're simply poor and they're looking for opportunity, and this is an opportunity for them to get some stuff, which is also, I think, probably exacerbated by the lockdowns, which are probably also a kind of an intrusive state. Like, yes, the virus is a real thing and the virus is killing people, but we should actually suggest to citizens how to protect themselves and realize that everything in life is a cost-benefit analysis, and public health is also affected by economic deprivation and economic strain and stress. And we have probably done far more damage to the population of the health of this country, not because of the virus, but because of essentially not facilitating people make their own plan and try to be as responsible and support people in being as responsible as they can in managing the risks. And then also focusing on the state. The state, instead of focusing on telling people what to do and locking them down, could have focused on its actual role of expanding hospital capacity. But you see, those sorts of things don't facilitate everything that was going on in the background. Expanding hospital capacity is money that is going into hospitals that isn't going into the state patronage network. Is money that isn't being grifted from sort of selling the illegal cigarettes, which are also part of the politically connected systems. So like a lot of these things are the level of corruption, the level of high ranking corruption within the ANC. It's so the ANC is such fundamentally a parasitic political force that can only facilitate itself through toxic racialist politics and the toxic racial relativistic narrative that it plugs itself into and that it orchestrates itself through, that Cyril Ramaphosa can't speak out against it because he's then dissolving the glue that is holding even his side of the ANC party together. So this is the fundamental contradiction which this turmoil has precipitated, which is a good contradiction, because if South African politics is ever to cleanse itself and purge itself of this kind of corruption on both sides of the fence, this contradiction at least brings it as close to the surface as it's ever gotten. In some sense, the media establishment, which has always been part of peddling the racial narrative and the racialist politics and amplifying the racialist politics, and the toxic group ethnocentric, the proto-fascists on the talk radio, the proto-fascists in the news media, framing stories in terms of inequality and social justice, or the toxic reinterpretation of these concepts of inequality and social justice, the group chauvinism, that the group sort of revenge, that retribution needs to be paid to the identity. Therefore, we need policy that empowers tokens of the identity, and you as a token of your identity faction needs to be bestowed with some kind of group pride, and then you have this aegis in which the rich kleptocratic elites can use the poor as a human shield to facilitate their grift, and can also promulgate policy which is essentially blatantly corrupt, like the Promotion of Equality Act, and like the acts like expropriation without compensation, and things like the NHI, which will, obviously facilitate endless amounts of state patronage and shady abuse of the Bill of Rights. And I would say that these are all also fundamentally extensions of this notion of the governmental prerogative, which the courts churned out in order to not protect the Constitution and protect the rights of the individual. So I would also say that there's a judicial component to the institutionalized corruption in politics that we face. And in some sense, I really despise the corruption in the judiciary for this, because they have created the ambit for the politicians to orchestrate this kind of manipulation and corrupt politics and disgusting racialist politics, which does not comport to the non-racial values of the Constitution, but essentially the constitutional judges, the constitutional court justices, have abrogated that by inventing the governmental prerogative in order to insulate the overtly racialistic policy of affirmative action, because affirmative action did not need to take the form of racial chauvinism. It could have taken the form of targeting disadvantage. Groups of disadvantaged people are not generalizations that include people that aren't disadvantaged. Quite simple. If you reread Section 9, the equality clauses, and you read it, and you must read it in conjunction with the limitations clause, these things are, and you need to, in some sense, at some point, read the limitations clause twice in order to get the actual jurisprudence functioning properly. Anyway, so if the ANC loses, the kind of politics that the ANC operates from, in terms of its internal structure, in terms of its command structure, like the politics. The ANC is an interesting kind of political party, and it will be very interesting to see how it adapts if it does not have an outright majority. If it doesn't have an outright majority, it might have to modulate its politics in order to facilitate, depending how far it gets from a majority. What would be awful is if the EFF and the ANC become the most combined, have a plurality of democratic mandates, or it might be in thirds, that you basically have the EFF, the ANC, and the DA, which are all roughly sort of a third. Or one would hope that you would still have perhaps the ANC in the high 30s or low 40s, the DA perhaps in a similar position, high 30s, low 40s, and the EFF with maybe in the high 20s, something like that. Where it goes then. And then the ANC perhaps says, out of principle, we will merge with the DA. We will try, the DA would be forced to try to have a coalition government with the ANC, because the alternative would be essentially would be the prospect of the alternative would be uh, would be too horrendous to even countenance, or you can't even consider it. It would just be it would be Zimbabwe, but with probably the army being used and towards some kind of genocidal project, and also a more overt constitutional degradation. The constitution will probably sort of be turned completely inside out and become sort of the hand puppet of this overtly parasitic. Because I mean, right now, the parasitism is concealed within the ideology of the racial consciousness and the racial chauvinism and the racialist politics and narrative peddling. It would become much more nasty. So the DA would have to try to forge a coalition with the ANC and be as and that would obviously require more conciliation from the ANC side, because the DA would be much more rigid in its need for certain red lines that can't be crossed, and the ANC would be fundamentally ravenous for its state patronage and its continued avenues of extraction. So that would be a rocky thing to calibrate. I mean, if there were any members in the ANC that were actually interested in rejuvenating the party and reforming it, the problem is that this ideology creates sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing sort of yeah. So I mean, the whole thing is partitioning the country seems like it might be a more stable political solution. Then at least you could say, well, the in places where the EFF and the ANC together have a majority, and people still are interested in that kind of political the kind of revolutionary scapegoat politics that sort of led to Zimbabwe and all those sorts of things. I mean, there might just be parts of the country that have been essentially radicalized by this bread and butter of the ANC for so long that they have damaged. They have invested in democratic illiteracy. They have invested in a kind of democratic deficit to make a pliable, low information block of voters that they can depend on, which is also been part of. See, it's interesting to see how the voting might be different. How if you actually have elections, it might be very interesting to see where the numbers actually are. I think the number that the EFF get are the most telling, because that will tell you how far gone democracy is in the country, just how far gone sort of the what people think of the Constitution, because I don't think you can share a society with people who don't believe in the Constitution, and certainly the EFF cohorts are overtly they don't even try to disguise it. they're full-blown fascists. Um, and obviously there is a large section of that within the ANC itself, and in some sense you would have to be, because if you believe in the ideological line that the ANC has taken and you still see that the country is not developing, is not growing, the only way that you can kind of uh, justify this to yourself is by radicalizing your ideological accusation even further. You have to invent a more profound grievance, and create a mythology around your identity being, um, you end up depending on this kind of socialized psychology of the matter, that, oh, the reason why things aren't developing is because we don't believe in our identity enough. Is that kind of, it's kind of like the ostrich with the head in the sand, doubling down into what are, to begin with, obviously shaky and false premises, proceeding from the worst kind of vile, malevolent sentiments. And if you don't like something, you just turn it into an accusation against somebody else. Uh, I mean, you even see this in Professor Lushaba's accusation that the tribal chief system was all set up by apartheid. So he can't even say that he doesn't like something unless he can sort of say, well, it was caused by someone that's part of the, the racial mythology, the racial narrative. There can be nothing that the identity has that is problematic, that wasn't inserted there exogenously, that wasn't an alien imposition. Um, this mythological purity in the group, in the group pride. It is toxic, and makes it impossible to have any kind of civil discourse over any issue, because you can't be pragmatic about anything. Um, you just have a kind of religious faith in your identity, and that is what has destroyed democracy in this country. Well, I mean, I guess perhaps I shouldn't speak too soon. I guess we'll see what happens in the voting. But the Nazis had their coup when they only won 20% of the vote. So before the Nazis seized power, and then after they seized power, I would say that you can't trust the election results. You can't, because they control the propaganda and the media after that. But they only had 20% of the vote. They were put in a coalition government, because to make them happy. And so it looks like South Africa might be heading towards that kind of acquiescence and coalition with them. And I think that this might be, unless people speak out critically against this style of politics, this EFF style politics of racial narrative and racial relativism, this is going to be just another historical um, note on the path to overt. Um, it's kind of the normalization of racialist politics, but I think that this might be an opportunity to underline and emphasize the toxicity of this racialist politics, that essentially the reason why these things are being destroyed is because of white monopoly capital. That is the rationale of the people who are of the political component of this coordinated economic sabotage. And so if that can be properly diagnosed, if that can be properly emphasized, and if the failure of Ramaphosa to speak out at debunking that line of political, is part of the problem that we sit with, is that we have unaccountable politics. We have politics that uses the racial narrative grift in order to disguise its own patronage and corruption, and therefore that's why Cyril Ramaphosa can't say that the destruction of these businesses in order to, he can't even, he can't countermand, he can't counteract, he can't openly say why the people that are doing this are corrupt and misguided. Because if he did that, he would be undermining his own political platform of the ANC. Because the ANC on both sides of the civil war used the racial narrative grifting. And it's interesting because in all the things that I said need to happen in order to have, let's say, the quickest resolution towards sort of rebuilding and actual development and growth, government getting it out of the way of the private sector and trying to support the private sector and actually focusing on doing its own role properly instead of state patronage and corruption. Actually just focus on providing its services and enabling people to be as empowered as they can, supporting them in that, not creating essentially mandates that are used to facilitate kleptocracy, elite capture of resources and mismanagement of resources, as you have to pay exorbitantly for black middlemen who are politically connected just to be part of the recipe of the black ownership in some deal, so that consumers have to pay more at the end of the day, which hurt the poor, and you just have a few black billionaires and millionaires profiting from this black economic empowerment. That's what we live with. While they add no value, and if there are black professionals that get a premium on their labor at any point, it really disrupts the labor market and makes and creates perverse incentives around hiring black professionals. Because if you give an experience to a black professional, they become a lucrative token in the labor market. They're going to be headhunted. So you can't retain your black staff because the labor market is fundamentally dysfunctional. Also, you have to do a disgusting form of racial accounting every time you want to have a small business. Then it doesn't work. It's hard enough just getting the people with the right skills in the room together. Now you have to count their race, and then so the whole thing is completely unworkable. It forces a kind of racial consciousness. It normalizes a kind of racial consciousness that is quite frankly part of the political toxicity that we are dealing with now, and also disguises the overt corruption of the big business. And so we have destroyed small and medium businesses essentially because of this. Anyway, I mean, there's more that can be said about that, but the warping of market signals within the labor market has also meant that there is no authentic development of skills, because it has, because of this racialist component getting in the way essentially. So you can't actually develop, governments can't actually, instead of government just making mandates on the private sector, it should actually create partnership projects where it actually seek to bridge disadvantaged people to the labor market. That actually, is trying to, that if people are looking for something, that they help they help to bridge the disadvantaged person to access to employment. And that can be also extra training and extra skills. But all of this extra training and extra skills and all these sorts of things are things that are actually within the ideology of the racial chauvinism are destroyed. That you can't actually skill up someone, that somehow the society should already value them as a token. It sort of it puts it really disempowers people, and then says that their disempowerment is disruptive to the system, and the disruption to the system is necessary and the definition of social justice. So you have this kind of self-disempowering sort of thing where, no, I shouldn't have to pass the test. I should just be given my credentials. I shouldn't have to, it doesn't matter what mark I get. I need to go to the next grade. It's that form of denigration. It's a form of sort of self-denigration and self-degradation. There's no integrity. They just think that there's an ideological trust that can be imposed by mandate, and you can just rely on that ideological trust, so that if someone doesn't treat you with the amount of integrity that you think that you have, because your credentials are actually just imposter credentials, because they were all artificially produced for you and you don't actually have the real skills, that you should still be treated as if you have the real skills, and somehow everyone else has to be sympathetic to the racial consciousness and make up for this deficit. That the ideological trust should win out against basic integrity. And so we've got a system that has been destroyed and corroded from every which way in order to facilitate this disgusting, dehumanizing creed that when you see an individual, you can't see them as an individual. You have to see them as part of a group, and have a kind of ideological trust in that group, and that should override the actual individual. So you've got this basic dehumanization that is baked into this disgusting racial consciousness, which has been facilitated by the courts instead of being countermanded by it. And that is one of the ingredients that has helped to facilitate this neo-apartheid mentality, that is a black racialist mentality that has been cultivated by the disgusting policy of the ANC, and has been used to disguise its state corruption as well. It all comes from the moral corruption, which is also fundamentally a corruption in the law, which should have been, you should have been able to go to court and say, you can't teach race and gender studies at university. It's anti-constitutional propaganda. It causes constitutional damage. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Fire these race and gender professors. Fire them. They are causing constitutional damages. They should be fined. They should not take state money from state funds to teach their racialist garbage. You should be able to say that the equality of the Promotion of Equality Act is racialist garbage legislation. It's morally corrupt and it facilitates corruption. It fails the constitutional test on both sides of efficacy, and in terms of the structure of its purpose is fundamentally rotten. And but the courts did not have the temerity to actually stick up for the Constitution against the executive, against the politics of the ANC. They bowed to the racialist politics of the ANC, because they are just as institutionally corrupt by this racialist ideology that they have fallen into and made room for, because it was so popular, because of these academics that normalized this fascistic garbage. And so we have been boiling the frog of democracy. The frog of democracy has been cooked in the pot that has been boiling for a long time now, and we need to have a 180 degrees reevaluation of this. And I don't know if anyone has the capacity to do that. I don't know if these radio presenters, which have fallen into the racialist grifting themselves, because they have normalized this racialist consciousness. They are just as morally culpable probably as the government themselves. Just, they say, well, the government isn't being effective, but they don't criticize its morality, because they, again, the actual democratic foundation and structure of government and state and the law has been institutionally corrupted by the help of these. These are the people who have been complicit in the degradation of South Africa. With their intellectualism and stuff. With their anyway, I'm not going to repeat myself. This is long enough recording.